The son he never knew. Ethan Caldwell never expected a funeral to change his life. But when an 8-year-old boy who looks just like him calls out, "Hi, Daddy," in front of the entire town, his past comes crashing back. Now, with secrets, unraveling, and a son he never knew, will Ethan get a second chance at the family he left behind? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The black limousine glided to a stop at the edge of Oakwood Cemetery. Ethan Caldwell straightened his Italian silk tie and took a deep breath before stepping out into the bright spring sunshine. At 42, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit. His dark hair was perfectly styled, with just a hint of grey at the temples that added to his distinguished appearance. "Are you sure you want to do this, sir?" asked Reynolds, his driver and personal assistant of 8 years. Ethan nodded, his jaw set in a firm line. "I have to. Frank Cooper gave me my start when no one else would. I owe him this much." It had been 12 years since Ethan had set foot in Riverdale. 12 years since he'd walked away from the small town that had felt too confining for his ambitions. Now he was back, a self-made millionaire whose face regularly appeared in business magazines and whose name struck both fear and admiration in boardrooms across the country. As he walked toward the gathering of mourners near the open grave, he felt the stares and whispers follow him. The local boy who'd made it big, the ruthless businessman who'd left everything behind. "I heard he's worth over $100 million now," someone whispered. "Didn't even come back when his own father died," another voice added. Ethan ignored them all. He hadn't come for them. He'd come for Frank, the hardware store owner who had given him his first job at 16, who had loaned him the money for his first semester of college when his own father had refused. He stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets as the minister spoke about Frank's life and legacy. Ethan's eyes drifted over the familiar faces, older now but still recognizable. Former teachers, old neighbors, the woman who used to babysit him when he was a kid. That's when he saw her. Jasmine Hayes stood on the opposite side of the grave, her chin held high, her elegant dark brown skin glowing in the sunlight. At 39, she was even more beautiful than he remembered. Her hair was different now, worn in shoulder-length braids instead of the natural curls he used to run his fingers through. She wore a simple black dress that hugged her curves, dignified and understated. Ethan felt his heart skip a beat, just like it used to whenever she walked into a room. Then he noticed the boy standing next to her. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old. He had Jasmine's warm brown skin and full lips, but there was something else about him, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. The shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he stood, with his shoulders squared and his hands in his pockets, mirroring Ethan's own stance. The boy looked exactly like him. As if sensing Ethan's gaze, the child looked up, and their eyes met across the grave. The boy's face lit up with recognition, though Ethan was certain they had never met. Then, with a bright smile that was like looking at his own childhood photos, the boy called out, "Hi, Daddy." The world seemed to stop. The minister's voice faded to a distant murmur. Every head turned, first to the boy, then to follow his gaze to Ethan. Jasmine's head snapped up, her eyes widening with panic, and then hardening with fury as she spotted Ethan. She grabbed the boy's hand protectively. "Miles, shh," she whispered urgently, but it was too late. The damage was done. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. "Daddy?" someone repeated in shock. "Ethan Caldwell has a son? Does that mean him and Jasmine?" Ethan stood frozen to the spot, unable to process what was happening. A son? He had a son? With Jasmine? How was that possible? They had broken up before he left town. She had never contacted him, never told him. The service ended in awkward tension. As people began to disperse, Ethan found himself moving through the crowd toward Jasmine and the boy, his son. But Jasmine was quicker. She took the child's hand and practically dragged him toward the parking lot. "Jasmine," Ethan called out, following them. "Jasmine, wait!" She stopped abruptly and turned to face him. Her eyes flashed with anger and something else, fear. "Not here, Ethan," she said through gritted teeth. "Not now. You can't just walk away," he said, his voice low but intense. "That boy called me Daddy. I think I deserve some answers." "Now you want answers?" she scoffed. After 12 years of silence? That's rich, even for you. The boy Miles looked between them with wide, confused eyes. "Mom," he said, tugging at Jasmine's hand, "is this really my dad? The one in the pictures?" Jasmine closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. "Miles, honey, why don't you go wait with Aunt Tricia by the car? I need to talk to Mr. Caldwell alone. But Mom, please, Miles, just for a minute." Reluctantly, the boy walked toward a middle-aged woman waiting by a modest sedan. Ethan recognized her as Jasmine's older sister. Once Miles was out of earshot, Jasmine turned to Ethan, her voice trembling with barely controlled emotion. "You don't get to show up after 12 years and start making demands," she said. "You gave up that right when you walked away without even saying goodbye." "I didn't know about him, Jasmine," Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "How could I? You never told me you were pregnant." "Would it have made a difference?" she challenged. "Would you have stayed? Given up your big dreams for a family in this small town you couldn't wait to escape?" The question hit Ethan like a punch to the gut because he didn't know the answer. At 28, with his first business just taking off, would he have been ready to be a father? Would he have made different choices? "I had a right to know," he said finally. "And Miles had a right to a father who wanted him," she shot back, "not one who saw him as an obstacle to his ambitions." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he rarely allowed himself to show in his corporate life. "Can we talk about this somewhere else?" he asked, aware of the curious stares they were attracting. "Please, Jasmine, I just found out I have a son. I need to understand." She seemed to deflate slightly, the fight going out of her. "Fine. Meet me at Cooper's Diner in an hour. I need to take Miles home first." "Cooper's is still open?" Ethan asked, momentarily distracted by the mention of the place where he and Jasmine had shared countless meals together as teenagers. A ghost of a smile flickered across her face. "Some things in Riverdale don't change, Ethan." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone among the gravestones, his life irrevocably altered in the space of a single moment. Cooper's Diner looked exactly as Ethan remembered it, the same red vinyl booths, the same black and white, checkered floor, even the jukebox in the corner, playing soft country music that provided a backdrop to the quiet conversations of the afternoon customers. Ethan sat in the back booth, nursing a cup of coffee that tasted just as bad as it had 12 years ago. He'd arrived early, needing time to gather his thoughts. His phone had been buzzing non-stop with messages from his executive assistant about meetings he was missing, contracts that needed his attention. For the first time in years, he had ignored them all. The bell above the door jingled, and Jasmine walked in. She had changed into jeans and a simple blouse, but she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had always drawn him to her. Several customers nodded in greeting as she passed, and she returned their acknowledgments with a smile. She slid into the booth across from him, her face carefully neutral. "Where's Miles?" Ethan asked. "With my sister," she replied. "I thought it would be better if we talked alone first." A waitress approached, young, probably in her 20s, but she looked at Ethan with recognition in her eyes. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," she said with a grin. "Ethan Caldwell himself. My mom used to say you'd either end up in prison or on the cover of Fortune magazine." Guess she was half right. Ethan managed a tight smile, trying to place her. "Dana's daughter. Good memory," she said. "Can I get you anything?" "Jasmine?" "Just coffee, thanks, Kelly." When the waitress left, an awkward silence fell between them. Ethan was the first to break it. "He looks like me," he said softly. Jasmine nodded. "Yes, it was difficult, watching him grow up, seeing your face looking back at me every day. Why didn't you tell me, Jasmine?" The question came out more accusatory than he'd intended. Her eyes flashed. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you left. I called your new number in Chicago 5 times. The last time," a woman answered. "Your secretary, I guess. She told me you'd made it clear you didn't want any contact with anyone from Riverdale, that you were starting fresh." Ethan winced. He remembered giving those instructions to his first assistant, desperate to cut ties with the small-town life he was so eager to leave behind. But he had meant nosy neighbors, former classmates looking for jobs, his alcoholic father, Not Jasmine, never Jasmine. I would have taken your call, he said. Maybe, she conceded. But then what? You were building your empire, Ethan. You made it very clear before you left that nothing was going to stand in your way. Not this town, not your family, and not me. The waitress returned with Jasmine's coffee, and they fell silent until she left. I was hurt, Jasmine continued, and proud. Too proud to beg you to be part of our lives when you'd made your choice so clear. So I made my own choice. I decided to raise Miles by myself and let him believe his father didn't want him. Ethan's voice was sharp with sudden anger. No, Jasmine said firmly. I never said that. I told him his father lived far away, that he had important work to do. As he got older and started asking more questions, I showed him articles about you, your success stories. He's actually very proud of you. Ethan sat back, stunned. He knew who I was. All this time? Of course he did. What did you think, that he just randomly called some stranger daddy at a funeral? Jasmine shook her head. Miles has your picture in his room. When he saw you standing there, he recognized you immediately. Ethan tried to process this information. His son had grown up knowing about him, looking at his picture, following his career from afar while he hadn't even known the boy existed. I want to meet him, Ethan said. Properly, I mean. I want to get to know him. Jasmine's expression grew cautious. Ethan, you can't just waltz into his life and then disappear again when you get bored or busy. He's a child, not a business acquisition. I know that, Ethan said, offended. He's my son, Jasmine. Biologically, yes, she agreed, but being a father is about more than DNA. It's about being there, day after day, year after year, through fevers and nightmares and school projects and heartbreaks. I want the chance to be that, Ethan said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. I've missed 8 years of his life. I don't want to miss any more. Jasmine studied him, her dark eyes searching his face as if trying to read the truth. In his words, how long are you staying in town? She asked finally. I was planning to leave tomorrow, Ethan admitted, but that was before I can extend my stay. For how long? A week, 2, and then what? It was a fair question, and one Ethan didn't have an immediate answer for. His life was in Chicago, his company, his penthouse apartment, his carefully structured existence where he controlled every variable. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'll figure it out. Jasmine sighed, running a finger around the rim of her coffee cup. Miles has been asking about you more and more lately, wondering why you never visit. I've been running out of excuses. A knot of guilt tightened in Ethan's chest. I'm sorry for that. I truly am. He has a baseball game tomorrow afternoon, Jasmine said after a moment of consideration. He's the starting pitcher for his little league team. If you want to come, I'll introduce you properly, but I need your word that you won't make promises you can't keep. He's been hurt enough in his life. I'll be there, Ethan said immediately. So our time, 3 o'clock, Riverdale Community Park. Ethan nodded, making a mental note to have Reynolds clear his schedule. The quarterly review with investors would have to... Wait, there's something else you should know, Jasmine said, her voice taking on a hesitant quality. I'm engaged. Ethan felt an unexpected pang in his chest. Oh. His name is David Mitchell. He's the high school principal. We've been together for 3 years. She twisted a simple diamond ring on her left hand that Ethan hadn't noticed before. He's been good to Miles, and to me. I'm happy for you, Ethan said automatically, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. He knows about you, of course, about Miles being your son. He's concerned about you suddenly appearing in Miles's life. He wants to make sure Miles doesn't get hurt. I'm not here to hurt anyone, Ethan said, least of all my own son. Jasmine nodded, but he could see the doubt in her eyes. I hope not. For everyone's sake. She glanced at her watch and sighed. I should go. Miles will be full of questions. What will you tell him? Ethan asked. The truth, she said simply. That you're staying in town for a few days and would like to get to know him. She paused. Where are you staying, by the way? The Riverdale Inn, Ethan said. It was the only hotel I could find in town. A smile tugged at Jasmine's lips. It's the only hotel in town, period. Some things really don't change around here. She stood up, reaching for her purse. Ethan stood as well, suddenly reluctant to see her go. "Jasmine," he said, stopping her as she turned to leave. "Thank you for agreeing to this, for raising our son so well, for everything." Something flickered in her eyes, a softness perhaps, or a memory of what they had once been to each other. "Don't thank me yet, Ethan," she said quietly. "You haven't met Miles properly. He has your stubbornness, your quick mind, and unfortunately, your talent for asking impossible questions. You might find fatherhood more challenging than business. Deals." With that, she walked away, leaving Ethan standing by the booth, watching her go just as he had 12 years before. Only this time he was determined not to let her walk out of his life again, not when there was so much at stake. The Riverdale Inn was a far cry from the luxury hotels Ethan was accustomed to. His room was small, with floral wallpaper that had to be at least 20 years old, and a bed that sagged slightly in the middle. But it was clean, and the elderly couple who ran the place had been so obviously impressed to have a big-shot Chicago businessman staying with them that Ethan hadn't had the heart to complain. He lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. A son. He had a son. The reality of it kept hitting him in waves, leaving him alternately elated and terrified. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Jessica, his executive assistant. "Mr. Caldwell," she began as soon as he answered, "the board is asking about the investor presentation scheduled for tomorrow. Should I tell them you'll be calling in?" Ethan closed his eyes, massaging the bridge of his nose. "No, Jessica, I won't be calling in. I need you to reschedule it." "Reschedule?" The surprise in her voice was evident. In 10 years, Ethan had never rescheduled a board meeting. "May I ask for how long?" "A week," Ethan said after a moment's hesitation. "Maybe more. I'm dealing with a personal matter. Is everything all right, sir?" Now there was concern in her voice. "Yes," Ethan said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Despite the shock and the complications, something about this situation felt right, necessary. "Everything is fine. I just need some time." "Of course, sir. I'll make the arrangements." She paused. "And the Henderson acquisition? The paperwork needs your signature by Friday." "Have Reynolds fly it down," Ethan decided. "He can bring me whatever else needs immediate attention." After ending the call, Ethan sat up and opened his laptop. With a few keystrokes, he pulled up the search engine and typed Miles Hayes Riverdale. Several results appeared, mostly related to local Little League games. There was a photo from the Riverdale Gazette showing a baseball team of young boys in blue uniforms. Ethan's heart jumped when he spotted Miles in the front row, grinning widely, holding a trophy. The caption read, "Riverdale Rockets win county championship. Pitcher Miles Hayes named MVP. His son was a baseball star." And Ethan had missed every game, every practice, every moment of triumph and disappointment. Next, he searched for Jasmine Hayes Riverdale and found her professional profile at Riverdale Community Hospital, where she worked. As a pediatric nurse, there were photos of her at community events, often with a tall, distinguished-looking man with salt and pepper hair, whom Ethan assumed was David Mitchell, the fiancé. They looked happy together, stable, the kind of family every child deserved. Where would he fit into that picture? Would Miles even want him in his life once the novelty wore off? And what about Jasmine? Could they ever move past the hurt and resentment to co-parent effectively? Ethan had built his business empire by anticipating problems and creating strategic solutions. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this situation. For the first time in years, he felt completely out of his depth. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from an unknown local number. "This is Jasmine. Miles would like to talk to you before tomorrow. Are you free for a phone call in 10 minutes? Ethan's heart raced as he typed back, "Yes, anytime." The longest 10 minutes of his life later, his phone rang again. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mr. Caldwell?" A young boy's voice came through the speaker, hesitant but eager. "This is Miles Hayes. I'm your son." Ethan had to clear his throat before he could speak. "Hello, Miles. It's really good to hear your voice. Mom said you're coming to my game tomorrow." "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Ethan promised. I'm the starting pitcher, Miles said, pride evident in his voice. I've got a pretty good fastball. Coach says I'm the best in the league. I bet you are, Ethan said, smiling despite the lump in his throat. I'm looking forward to seeing you play. There was a pause, and then Miles asked in a smaller voice, how come you never came to see me before? Were you too busy with your company and stuff? The direct question, asked with such innocent curiosity, cut Ethan to the core. How could he explain the truth without making Jasmine look bad or making himself seem like the villain he probably was? Miles, he said carefully, the truth is I didn't know about you until today. If I had known I had such an amazing son, I would have been at every single one of your games. Really? The hope in that single word nearly broke Ethan's heart. Really, he confirmed. And now that I do know, I want to learn everything about you. Your favorite color, your favorite food, your favorite subject in school, everything. Blue, Miles said immediately. Pizza with extra cheese, and science. We're learning about volcanoes right now. It's pretty cool. Ethan laughed, a genuine laugh that felt foreign after so many years of practiced corporate chuckles. Volcanoes are definitely cool. Maybe we could build one together sometime. For real? Miles sounded excited. Mom's fiancé David tried to help me with my science project, but he's more into history stuff. He's the high school principal, you know. Yes, your mom mentioned that, Ethan said, trying to keep any trace of jealousy out of his voice. This David person had been there for Miles when Ethan hadn't been. He should be grateful, not resentful. He's okay, Miles said, with the casual assessment of a child. But he doesn't know anything about business, not like you. I told all my friends my dad is a millionaire who runs a big company in Chicago. Nobody believed me until I showed them. Your picture in the magazine. Ethan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. His son had been bragging about him, defending him, proud of him from afar, while Ethan hadn't even known he existed. Mom says I need to go to bed now, Miles said reluctantly. Gotta rest up for the big game tomorrow. You promise you'll be there, right? I promise, Ethan said firmly. I'll be in the front row cheering the loudest. Cool. Good night, Dad. The last word was said tentatively, as if Miles was testing how it felt. Good night, Miles, Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. Sleep well. I'll see you tomorrow. After the call ended, Ethan sat in the quiet room, the phone still clutched in his hand, tears streaming down. His face for the first time in years. Tomorrow he would start to make things right. Tomorrow he would begin the journey of becoming the father his son deserved. But first, he had a lot of thinking to do about what that would mean for his carefully constructed life in Chicago. Because one thing was already becoming clear. Meeting Miles had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were before. The son he never knew. Part 2. Ethan woke early the next morning, his mind still reeling from yesterday's revelations. He showered and dressed carefully, choosing a casual button-down shirt and slacks instead of his usual business suit. Today wasn't about being CEO Ethan Caldwell. It was about being Miles's father. After a quick breakfast at the local cafe, where he endured curious stares from the townspeople, Ethan decided to take a walk around Riverdale. The small town had changed less than he expected. Main Street still had the same hardware store where Frank Cooper had given him his first job. The movie theater, where he and Jasmine had shared their first kiss, was still standing, though the marquee advertised films he hadn't yet seen. As he passed Riverdale Elementary School, he slowed his pace. Would that be where Miles went to school? Did he enjoy it? Did he have many friends? There were so many questions, so many pieces of his son's life that were complete mysteries to him. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Reynolds. Sir, I've landed at the regional airport. Should I drive the documents to you now? No, Ethan decided. Meet me at the baseball field at the community park at 4. I'll sign everything after the game. The baseball field? Reynolds sounded confused. He had been with Ethan long enough to know his boss had no particular interest in sports. Yes, Reynolds. My son is playing today. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Your son, sir? It's a long story, Ethan said. I'll explain later. He ended the call and continued his walk, eventually making his way to the community park where Miles's game would be held. The baseball diamond was empty now, the morning dew still sparkling. On the grass, Ethan sat in the bleachers, trying to imagine what it would be like to watch his son pitch from this very spot in just a few hours. A voice startled him from his thoughts. "Bit early for a game, isn't it?" Ethan turned to see a man approaching, tall and distinguished with salt and pepper hair. He recognized him immediately from the photos online, David Mitchell, Jasmine's fiancé. "Just getting the lay of the land," Ethan replied, standing up and extending his hand. "Ethan Caldwell." "I know who you are," David said, shaking his hand firmly. "David Mitchell." The two men sized each other up in silence for a moment. "Jasmine told me you'd be at the game," David said finally. "She also mentioned you didn't know about Miles until yesterday." "That's right," Ethan confirmed, wondering where this conversation was headed. David nodded, his expression neutral but his eyes watchful. "Miles was up half the night, too excited to sleep. He's been talking non-stop about you coming to his game." Guilt and pleasure mingled in Ethan's chest. "I'm looking forward to it." "I need to be clear about something," David said, his tone becoming more serious. "Miles is a great kid, sensitive, though he tries to hide it. Jasmine and I have worked hard to give him stability, structure, love. I don't want to see that disrupted." "I'm not here to disrupt anything," Ethan said, bristling slightly at the implied accusation. "I just want to get to know my son." "And then what?" David challenged. "You return to your life in Chicago, and Miles is left wondering why his father disappeared again? Kids need consistency, Mr. Caldwell." "Call me Ethan," he said automatically, then added, "and I'm aware of what kids need. I'm still figuring out how to balance everything, but I'm committed to being part of Miles's life from now on." David studied him for a long moment. "For what it's worth, I believe you mean that right now. But meaning it and doing it are two different things. I've seen Miles's face every time he reads about you in a magazine or sees you on the business news. He's proud of you, but there's always that question in his eyes. Why doesn't his dad want to know him?" The words hit Ethan hard. "I want to make that right." "I hope you do," David said sincerely, "for Miles's sake." He checked his watch. "I should go. I promised to help set up the concession stand before the game. Jasmine will be bringing Miles around 2:30 for warm-ups." As David turned to leave, Ethan called after him, "Mitchell, you seem like a good man. Miles is lucky to have you in his life." David paused, then nodded in acknowledgement before walking away, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts once more. By 3 o'clock, the community park was bustling with activity. Parents and siblings filled the bleachers, chatting and laughing as they waited for the game to begin. Ethan sat somewhat awkwardly in the front row, feeling out of place among these people who shared a community and history he was no longer part of. He spotted Jasmine near the dugout, helping to organize the team's equipment. She wore jeans and a blue t-shirt that matched the team colors, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Even in such casual clothes, she took his breath away. Then he saw Miles, jogging out onto the field in his blue and white uniform, glove in hand. Ethan's heart swelled with a pride he'd never experienced before. His son. His boy. As if sensing Ethan's presence, Miles looked toward the bleachers. When he spotted Ethan, his face lit up with a smile so wide it was visible from across the field. He waved enthusiastically, then turned to tug at Jasmine's sleeve, pointing excitedly in Ethan's direction. Jasmine followed Miles's gesture and locked eyes with Ethan. She gave a small, hesitant smile and a nod of acknowledgement. Then she bent down to say something to Miles, who immediately broke into a run toward the bleachers. "You came!" Miles exclaimed as he approached, slightly out of breath. "You really came." "I promised I would," Ethan said, smiling back at his son. Up close, the resemblance between them was even more striking. It was like looking at a childhood photo of himself, but with Jasmine's warm brown skin and expressive eyes. "Mom said, I can sit with you for a few minutes before warm-ups," Miles said, climbing onto the bleacher next to Ethan. "Is it true you came in a fancy car?" Ethan chuckled. "Not today. I flew in for the funeral and I've been walking around town since I got here. But you have one in Chicago, right?" Miles pressed. "A cool one?" "I have a car service," Ethan admitted. "My assistant Reynolds usually drives me around." "Like a chauffeur?" Miles's eyes widened. That's awesome. It's just practical, Ethan said, surprised at how extravagant his normal life seemed when viewed through his son's eyes. I can work while I'm being driven to meetings. Do you have a really big house too? Miles asked, his curiosity seemingly endless. An apartment, actually, on the 42nd floor of a building downtown. 42nd floor? Miles gasped. You can probably see the whole city from there. Ethan nodded, thinking about the view of Lake Michigan from his penthouse windows. How had he stopped appreciating that? You'd like it, he said, then added, impulsively, maybe you could visit sometime. Miles's face lit up. Really, could I? Before Ethan could respond, a whistle blew from the field, and Jasmine called out, Miles, warm-ups. I gotta go, Miles said reluctantly. But you'll watch me pitch, right? Every second, Ethan promised. Good luck out there. Miles beamed at him one more time before racing back to join his team. Ethan noticed Jasmine watching their interaction with a guarded expression. When their eyes met, she quickly looked away, turning her attention back to the team. The bleachers around Ethan began to fill as game time approached. A woman with graying hair sat down next to him, giving him a curious look. You're Ethan Caldwell, aren't you? She asked. Janet Wilson. I taught English at Riverdale High when you were a student. Ethan smiled politely, vaguely remembering the woman. Nice to see you again, Mrs. Wilson. I always knew you'd go far, she said. But I must say, everyone was surprised when the news broke yesterday. At his questioning look, she elaborated. About Miles being your son, small town, you know, word travels fast. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. I only just found out. Myself. Mrs. Wilson's eyebrows shot up. Is that so? Well, he's a wonderful boy. Smart as a whip, just like you were. And quite the baseball player, as you're about to see. The game began with Miles taking the pitcher's mound. Ethan watched, transfixed, as his son wound up and delivered his first pitch, a perfect strike. The small crowd cheered and Ethan found himself on his feet, clapping and shouting encouragement. As the game progressed, Ethan was amazed by Miles's skill and focus. The boy pitched 3 solid innings before moving to first base to give another player a turn on the mound. Throughout it all, Miles would occasionally glance toward the bleachers, as if making sure Ethan was still there and watching. During the 7th inning stretch, Ethan noticed Reynolds arrive carrying a briefcase and looking thoroughly out of place in his tailored suit. The assistant spotted Ethan and made his way over. Sir, Reynolds said, nodding respectfully, I have the Henderson documents for you to sign. Not now, Reynolds, Ethan said, his eyes tracking Miles as the boy stepped up to bat. Wait until after the game. But sir, the deadline… I said not now, Ethan repeated firmly, just as Miles connected with the ball, sending it soaring into the outfield. The crowd erupted in cheers as Miles raced to first base, then rounded towards second. As the outfielder scrambled to retrieve the ball, Go, Miles, Ethan shouted, caught up in the excitement. Run! Miles slid into second base just as the ball came whizzing in from the outfield. Safe, called the umpire, and Miles jumped to his feet with a triumphant grin, looking immediately to Ethan for approval. Ethan gave him a thumbs up, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. He had closed billion-dollar deals, been featured on the cover of Fortune magazine, dined with senators and CEOs, but nothing in his life had ever felt as satisfying as watching his son play baseball on a sunny afternoon in Riverdale. Reynolds, sensing he was fighting a losing battle, retreated to a bench at the edge of the park to wait. Ethan barely noticed him leave, too engrossed in the game unfolding before him. In the end, Miles's team won by 2 runs, as the players celebrated. On the field, Miles broke away from his teammates and ran directly to Ethan in the bleachers. Did you see? He asked breathlessly. Did you see my double? I saw everything, Ethan assured him, impulsively pulling the boy into a hug. You were amazing out there. Miles hugged him back without hesitation, his small arms wrapping tightly around Ethan's waist. It was such a simple gesture, but it shook Ethan to his core. This child, his child, was offering him trust and affection so freely, without reservation or calculation. It was a kind of love Ethan hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. Miles, Jasmine's voice interrupted the moment. She approached with a mixture of caution and determination in her eyes. "Great job today, honey. Why don't you go celebrate with your team? Coach has popsicles for everyone." Miles nodded, but looked back at Ethan. "Are you leaving now?" "Not yet," Ethan said quickly. Maybe we could have dinner together later, if it's okay with your mum." Miles turned hopefully to Jasmine, who hesitated before reluctantly nodding. "I suppose that would be all right. We usually go to Mario's after a win anyway." "Mario's Pizza is still open?" Ethan asked, remembering the small pizzeria where he used to take Jasmine on dates when they were teenagers. "Different owner, same recipes," Jasmine said with a small smile. "Miles, go on now. We'll meet you at the car in a few minutes." Once Miles was out of earshot, Jasmine turned to Ethan with a serious expression. "You're good with him." "He makes it easy," Ethan said honestly. "He's an incredible kid, Jasmine. You've done an amazing job raising him." She accepted the compliment with a nod. "He likes you, a lot. I'm worried about how attached he's getting so quickly." "Is that a bad thing?" Ethan asked. "It is if you're going to disappear from his life as suddenly as you appeared in it," she said bluntly. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I told you yesterday, I don't want to miss any more of his life. I'm trying to figure out how to make this work, long term." "And have you?" she challenged. "Figured it out, I mean." "Not entirely," he admitted. "But I'm working on it. I've already extended my stay here. I'm thinking about maybe finding a more permanent place in town." Jasmine's eyes widened in surprise. "You'd move back to Riverdale?" "Maybe not permanently," Ethan said, still thinking through the logistics as he spoke. "But I could split my time, set up a satellite office here, video conference for meetings when I can't be in Chicago." "That's a big change," Jasmine said slowly. "A necessary one," Ethan countered. "You were right yesterday. Being a father isn't something I can do part-time or from a distance. Miles deserves better than that." Before Jasmine could respond, Reynolds approached again, clearing his throat apologetically. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Henderson deadline..." Ethan sighed. "Give me 5 minutes, Reynolds." As his assistant withdrew again, Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "The real world calls. A business deal," Ethan explained. "Nothing that can't wait a little longer." "The Ethan I knew would never have said that," Jasmine observed. "Business always came first." "The Ethan you knew didn't have a son," he said. Simply. Something in Jasmine's expression softened. "We'll see you at Mario's in an hour. That will give Miles time to celebrate with his team and get cleaned up." Ethan nodded. "I'll be there." As Jasmine walked away to join Miles, Ethan turned, his attention to Reynolds and the waiting documents. For the first time in his career, signing million-dollar contracts felt like a distraction from what really mattered. Mario's Pizza had changed ownership, but the red and white checkered tablecloths and the mouth-watering aroma of oregano and fresh dough remained the same. Ethan arrived early and secured a corner booth, feeling oddly nervous like a teenager on a first date rather than a successful businessman. The restaurant began to fill with families, many coming directly from the baseball game. Ethan received more than a few curious glances and whispered comments. His return to Riverdale and the discovery of his son had clearly become the talk of the town. The bell above the door jingled, and Ethan looked up to see Jasmine enter with Miles. But they weren't alone. David Mitchell was with them, one hand resting casually on Miles's shoulder in a gesture that spoke of familiarity and affection. Ethan's gut twisted with an unexpected pang of jealousy. This man had been in his son's life for the past 3 years. He had attended games, helped with homework, shared meals like this one, all the everyday moments that Ethan had missed. Miles spotted him immediately and waved, breaking away from Jasmine and David to race toward the booth. "Dad, we're here," he called out, the word dad still new and wonderful to Ethan's ears. "I see that," Ethan said, sliding over to make room for Miles. "Great game today, champ." Miles beamed at the praise. "Coach said my fastball was even better than last time. I've been practicing every day." Jasmine and David reached the table, and after a moment of awkward hesitation, they slid into the booth across from Ethan and Miles. "Hope you don't mind if I join you," David said, his tone friendly but his eyes watchful. "I promised Miles I'd treat him to pizza after the game." "The more the merrier," Ethan replied, though his smile felt strained. A waitress approached, smiling broadly at Miles. "Well, if it isn't our star pitcher, the usual buddy?" "Yes, please," Miles said. "Extra cheese and a root beer," Jasmine added, giving Miles a knowing look when he started to protest. Water first, then one root beer with dinner. The easy familiarity of their interaction highlighted just how much of an outsider Ethan still was in his son's life. They had routines, inside jokes, established rules, a family dynamic that he had no part in. "So, Ethan," David said after they had placed their orders, "Jasmine mentioned you might be staying in Riverdale longer than planned." "That's right," Ethan confirmed. "I'm exploring some options that would allow me to spend more time here." "Like, what?" Miles asked eagerly. "Well, I'm thinking about finding a place to live here," Ethan said cautiously, watching Jasmine's reaction. "Maybe a house with a yard closer to your school." Miles's eyes lit up. "Really, that would be awesome. Then we could hang out all the time and you could come to all my games." "That's the idea," Ethan said, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. "But what about your company?" David asked. "From what I understand, Caldwell Technologies is headquartered in Chicago. That's quite a commute." "I'm working on arrangements," Ethan said. "Modern technology makes remote work more feasible than ever, and I have a very capable executive team." Jasmine looked skeptical. "The Ethan I remember was hands-on with everything. You said you'd rather work 20 hours a day than delegate important decisions." "People change," Ethan said, meeting her gaze. "Priorities change." David cleared his throat. "Speaking of changes, Miles has some news of his own." "Don't you, buddy?" Miles nodded excitedly. "I got picked for the All-Star team. We're going to play in the regional tournament next month." "That's fantastic," Ethan exclaimed. "Congratulations." "It's in Springfield," Miles continued. "We'll have to stay there for 3 days. Mom and David already said they could take time off work to come with me." Ethan saw an opportunity and seized it. "I'd love to be there too, if that's okay." Miles turned to him, eyes wide with hope. "Really? You'd come watch me play?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Ethan promised, ignoring the warning look from Jasmine. He knew she was concerned about him making promises he might not keep, but he was determined to prove her wrong. The waitress returned with their pizza, momentarily pausing the conversation. As they ate, Miles dominated the discussion with baseball talk, occasionally asking Ethan questions about Chicago and his work. Ethan answered each query patiently, enjoying his son's curiosity and enthusiasm. "Do you have any kids in Chicago?" Miles asked suddenly, causing Ethan to nearly choke on his pizza. "No," he managed after taking a sip of water. "No other children. No wife either." "Miles," Jasmine said in a warning tone, "that's not polite to ask." "It's okay," Ethan assured her, then turned to Miles. "No, I'm not married. I've been focused on my work for a long time." "So you're all alone?" Miles asked, his expression concerned. The question hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had never thought of himself as alone before. Busy, driven, successful, yes. But hearing it framed that way by his 8-year-old son made him realize the truth of it. "I have friends," he said, trying to sound more positive than he felt. "Colleagues, but no family, no, not until now." Miles seemed to consider this, then brightened. "Well, now you have me, and Mom, and David too, I guess." Jasmine and David exchanged a look that Ethan couldn't quite interpret. There was concern there, certainly, but something else too. A shared understanding that excluded him. "Miles," David said gently, "remember what we talked about? About taking things one step at a time." Miles nodded, though he looked disappointed. "Yeah, I know, but still it's cool that my dad is here now, right?" "Very cool," David agreed, surprising Ethan with his sincerity. "Your dad coming to your game today made you happy, and that's what matters most to your mom and me." The rest of the dinner passed pleasantly enough, with Miles continuing to dominate the conversation. When the meal was over, Ethan insisted on paying, waving away both Jasmine's and David's objections. As they stood to leave, Miles turned to Ethan with hopeful eyes. "Will I see you tomorrow?" Ethan glanced at Jasmine, who gave a small nod. "Yes," he said. "In fact, I was hoping maybe we could spend the day together. If your mom agrees, of course." "Can I, Mom?" Miles asked immediately. "Please." Jasmine hesitated, then relented. I suppose so. But you have school in the morning. Ethan could pick. You up afterward around 3:30? Perfect, Ethan said, relief washing over him. Another day with his son. Another chance to build the relationship he'd been denied for 8 years. They walked out to the parking lot together, where Jasmine, David, and Miles headed toward a sensible family sedan. As Miles climbed into the back seat, he rolled down the window to call out to Ethan. Bye, Dad. See you tomorrow. See you tomorrow, Ethan echoed, waving as the car pulled away. He stood in the parking lot for a long moment, watching until their tail lights disappeared around a corner. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed Reynolds. I need you to extend our stay indefinitely, he said when his assistant answered, and start looking into real estate options in Riverdale, something suitable for a family. Sir? Reynolds sounded confused. Are you relocating the company? No, Ethan said, just myself, at least part-time. After ending the call, Ethan walked back toward the Riverdale Inn, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. For the first time in years, the challenge before him wasn't about market shares or profit margins. It was about becoming the father that Miles deserved and finding a way to be part of a family he never knew he wanted. The next few days fell into a pattern. Ethan would spend his mornings handling business matters remotely, then meet Miles after school for a few hours of father-son time. They played catch in the park, built a model volcano for Miles's science project, and explored the creek where Ethan used to fish as a boy. Ethan was amazed at how quickly and easily he fell in love with his son. Miles was smart, funny, kind-hearted, everything a father could hope for in a child. And Miles, in turn, seemed eager to soak up every moment with the father he'd only known from pictures and news articles. On Thursday afternoon, Ethan sat on a bench in the town square, waiting for Miles to emerge from his after-school robotics club. He scrolled through emails on his phone, occasionally glancing up at the elementary school across the street. Mind, if I join you? Ethan looked up to see Jasmine standing there dressed in scrubs. She must have come directly from the hospital. Please, he said, moving over to make room for her on the bench. She sat down, leaving a careful distance between them. I got off my shift early. Thought I'd pick up Miles myself today. He's having a great time in that robotics club, Ethan commented. He wants me to help him build a more advanced robot this weekend. Jasmine smiled. He's always been interested in how things work. Takes after you that way. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching as parents began to gather in front of the school. I've really been showing up for him, Jasmine said finally, her voice quiet. I have to admit I wasn't sure you would. I told you I would, Ethan said, trying not to sound defensive. People say a lot of things they don't mean, Ethan, especially when they're caught off guard by life-changing news. She turned to look at him directly. But you've been here every day just like you promised. Is that so hard to believe? The Ethan I knew, she said with a small, sad smile. Yes, business always came first. Nothing and no one could compete with your ambition. Ethan winced, knowing she was right. I was young, driven. I thought success meant climbing to the top no matter what, or who I had to leave behind. And now? Now I know better, he said simply. Or I'm learning at least. Jasmine studied him for a long moment. Miles adores you, you know. He talks about you constantly. Dad said this and Dad knows that. It's all I hear about these days. Pride and guilt warred in Ethan's chest. I'm trying to be worthy of that. That's what worries me, Jasmine admitted. He's already so invested in this relationship. What happens when you have to go back to Chicago, when you miss a baseball game because of an important meeting, when real life intrudes on this perfect father-son fantasy you two have created? It won't be perfect, Ethan acknowledged. I know that. There will be challenges, compromises, but I'm committed to making it work, Jasmine. I'm looking at houses here in Riverdale. I've been reorganizing my executive team to handle more day-to-day operations without me. Jasmine looked surprised. You're really serious about this? Of course I am, Ethan said firmly. He's my son. Before she could respond, the school doors opened and children began streaming out. Miles spotted them almost immediately and came running over, his backpack bouncing against his back. Mom, Dad, you're both here, he exclaimed, his face lighting up with joy. Special treat today, Jasmine said, smiling at her son's enthusiasm. I thought maybe we could all get ice cream together. Really? Miles looked between them, as if afraid to believe it was true. Sounds good to me, Ethan said, standing up. Lead the way, champ. As they walked toward the ice cream parlor, Miles in the middle, chattering excitedly about his day, Ethan found himself stealing glances at Jasmine. She had been the first and only woman he had ever truly loved. Walking beside her now with their son between them, he couldn't help but wonder what might have been if he had made different choices 12 years ago. The ice cream parlor was crowded with after-school customers, but they managed to find a small table near the window. Miles dug into his chocolate chip cookie dough cone with gusto, while Ethan and Jasmine opted for cups of coffee ice cream. So, Jasmine said, after Miles had given them a detailed account of his robotics project, David and I were thinking of having a barbecue this Sunday. Nothing fancy, just a few friends and neighbors. We thought, well, if you're free, you might want to join us. The invitation caught Ethan off guard. You and David want me there? It was actually David's idea, Jasmine admitted. He said if you're going to be part of Miles's life long-term, we should all try to get along. For Miles's sake. Smart man, Ethan said, genuinely impressed with David's maturity. I'd be happy to come. Awesome, Miles exclaimed. You can meet all my friends, and you can see our house. I have a tree house in the backyard that David built for me. That sounds great, Ethan said, ignoring the twinge of jealousy at the mention of the tree house David had built. He had to remind himself that David had been there when he hadn't been. The man had earned his place in Miles's life. They finished their ice cream, and Jasmine checked her watch. We should head home. Miles has homework, and David's making dinner tonight. Of course, Ethan said, trying not to show his disappointment at their time together ending. As they walked out of the ice cream shop, Miles suddenly asked, Can Dad come for dinner too? Jasmine looked startled. Well, not tonight, Ethan interjected quickly, saving her from having to refuse. I have some work calls to make, but I'll see you tomorrow after school, okay? Miles nodded, though he looked disappointed. Promise? Promise, Ethan confirmed. As they said their goodbyes, Miles surprised Ethan with a fierce hug. I'm really glad you're my dad, he whispered. Ethan hugged him back, his throat tight with emotion. Me too, Miles. More than you can imagine. He watched as Jasmine and Miles walked toward their car, hand in hand. Something about seeing them together like that, about knowing he would see them again tomorrow and the day after, filled him with a contentment he had never found in all his years of chasing success. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Checking the screen, he saw it was Jessica, his assistant in Chicago. Mr. Caldwell, she began when he answered, the board is expressing concerns about your extended absence. They're questioning your commitment to the Henderson acquisition. The acquisition is proceeding as planned, Ethan said, his voice taking on the crisp, authoritative tone he used for business matters. Reynolds has been bringing me the necessary documents daily. Yes, but they feel that your personal presence is required for the negotiations. Mr. Henderson specifically asked for you to be at the final meeting next week in Chicago. Ethan frowned. The Henderson deal was worth millions to Caldwell Technologies. Under normal circumstances, he would already be preparing his strategy, reviewing the contract line by line, planning how to secure the best possible terms. But now, the thought of leaving Riverdale, of leaving Miles even for a few days, felt wrong. He had promised to be at his son's school presentation next week, had planned to help him prepare for it over the weekend. I'll video conference in, he decided. Sir, Jessica said hesitantly, Mr. Henderson was quite clear. He wants to look you in the eye when he signs. He's old-fashioned that way. Ethan sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Tell the board I'm considering my options. I'll give them an answer tomorrow. After ending the call, Ethan stood on the sidewalk, the weight of competing responsibilities pressing down on him. For the first time in his career, the path forward wasn't clear. The business decision was obvious. Go to Chicago, secure the deal, return to Riverdale afterward. But the human decision? The father decision? That was much more complicated. Because no matter what he did, someone would be disappointed. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell wasn't sure which disappointed face would haunt him more, a business associate's or his 8-year-old son's. The son, he never. Newly wakened Part 3 Ethan paced the floor of his small hotel room, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with Victor Henderson, the CEO of Henderson Electronics. "Victor, I understand your position," Ethan said, struggling to keep the frustration from his voice, "but surely we can compromise here. My team is fully prepared to handle the final negotiations." "No offense, Ethan," Henderson replied, his voice crackling through the speakerphone, "but I've been dealing with you personally for 6 months. I'm not signing anything unless you're sitting across the table from me. That's my final word on the matter." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I see. And it has to be next Wednesday. There's no flexibility in the timing." "None. I'm leaving for Japan on Thursday for 3 weeks. It's now or we push this back to next quarter. The delay would cost Caldwell Technologies millions and potentially give their competitors an opening to swoop in. Under normal circumstances, there would be no question about what Ethan would do. He'd be on the next flight to Chicago. But he had promised Miles he would be at his science presentation next Wednesday. His son had been working on his volcano project all week, and Ethan had promised to be in the front row. "I need to check something, Victor. Can I call you back in an hour?" After ending the call, Ethan sat heavily on the edge of the bed. The walls of the small hotel room felt like they were closing in on him. He needed air, space to think. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, walking aimlessly through the familiar streets of Riverdale. Without conscious intention, his feet carried him to the elementary school playground. It was empty now, the swings moving gently in the evening breeze. Ethan sat on a bench, watching as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the blacktop. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken over the past few days. Miles pitching at his baseball game. Miles grinning proudly beside their completed volcano model. Miles on the swings in this very playground, his head thrown back in laughter as Ethan pushed him higher. A week ago, these moments didn't exist for him. A week ago, he didn't know he had a son. And now the thought of missing even one more precious moment felt unbearable. But he had responsibilities in Chicago, hundreds of employees depending on him, investors who had trusted him with their money, a company he had built from nothing. His phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. "Miles wants to say goodnight. Can he call you?" Ethan's heart lifted as he typed back, "Of course." Moments later, his phone rang, and Miles's excited voice came through. "Dad, guess what? I tested the volcano and it works perfect. The lava goes super high." "That's fantastic," Ethan said, smiling despite the weight on his shoulders. "I can't wait to see it at your presentation." "Ms. Johnson says parents can sit in the front row," Miles continued. "Mom and David will be there too, but there's enough room for all of you." The casual assumption that Ethan would be there sitting alongside Jasmine and David like a normal, functional family made his chest ache with both joy and anxiety. "Miles, he began, then stopped himself. He couldn't bear to disappoint his son. Not yet. Not before he'd exhausted every possible option. "I'm really proud of you, buddy. You've worked hard on that project." "It's all thanks to you, Dad," Miles said, and Ethan could hear the smile in his voice. "Nobody else's dad knows as much about volcanoes as you do." After chatting for a few more minutes about Miles's day at school, they said their goodnights. Ethan sat in the growing darkness, his decision crystallizing with painful clarity. He dialed Reynolds's number. "I need you to arrange a video conference with the board for tomorrow morning, and book me a flight to Chicago for Tuesday night, returning Wednesday evening. It would be tight." He would fly to Chicago Tuesday night, meet with Henderson Wednesday morning, and fly back to Riverdale in time for Miles's presentation in the afternoon. He'd have to trust his team to finalize the paperwork after the handshake. It wasn't ideal from a business perspective, but it was the best compromise he could manage. As he walked back to the hotel, Ethan felt both relieved to have made a decision and anxious about the precarious balancing act he was attempting. His old life and his new one were colliding, and he wasn't sure if he could satisfy the demands of both. The Sunday barbecue at Jasmine and David's house was in full swing when Ethan arrived. The modest 2-story home was surrounded by a white picket fence with a well-maintained yard, where children ran playing tag while adults chatted in groups, holding paper plates and plastic cups. Ethan felt oddly nervous as he walked up the driveway, a bottle of wine in one hand and a wrapped package in the other. He had spent more time than he cared to admit selecting a gift for Miles, a complex robotics kit that the store clerk had assured him was suitable for advanced 8-year-olds. "Dad!" Miles's voice rang out across the yard as he spotted Ethan. The boy came running, dodging through the groups of adults. "You came?" "I said I would, didn't I?" Ethan said, smiling as Miles barreled into him for a hug. "Is that for me?" Miles asked, eyeing the wrapped package. "Miles," Jasmine admonished, approaching with a plate of hamburger buns. "Don't be rude." "Hello, Ethan. Glad you could make it." She looked beautiful in a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders. Ethan felt a familiar flutter in his chest that he quickly suppressed. "Thanks for inviting me," he said, holding out the wine. "I brought this for you and David." "That's very thoughtful," she said, accepting the bottle. "David's at the grill. Why don't you go say hello while I put this inside? Miles, show your father. Where the drinks are, please." As Miles led him through the crowd, Ethan noticed the curious glances from the other guests. He recognized a few faces, parents from the baseball game, some old classmates who had stayed in Riverdale, but most were strangers to him. David stood at a large grill on the back patio, spatula in hand, wearing an apron that read, "The Grill." "Master." He looked up as Ethan and Miles approached. "Ethan, welcome," he said, extending his hand. "Glad you could join us." "Thanks for having me," Ethan replied, impressed despite himself by David's genuineness. The man seemed to have no insecurity about Ethan's presence in Miles's life, no territorial instinct that might have been understandable under the circumstances. "Dad brought me a present," Miles said, holding up the package. "That's very nice," David said, giving Ethan a meaningful look. "Why don't you open it after dinner? The burgers are almost ready." Miles reluctantly agreed, placing the gift carefully on a nearby table before running off to join his friends. "Beer?" David offered, gesturing to a cooler by the grill. "Sure," Ethan said, helping himself to a bottle. "So," David said as he flipped burgers, "Jasmine tells me you're looking at houses in Riverdale." "That's right," Ethan confirmed. "I toured a few properties yesterday. There's a nice place on Maple Street that has potential." "Maple's a good area," David nodded. "Close to the school. Miles could even walk there from that neighborhood." The casual way David discussed what was best for Miles reinforced his established role in the boy's life. Ethan felt that now familiar twinge of jealousy but pushed it aside. "That's what I was thinking," he said, "though I'll still need to commute to Chicago regularly for work." "Finding that balance can be tough," David commented. "When I first became principal, I was bringing work home every night. Jasmine helped me see that Miles needed my time more than the paperwork did." Ethan nodded, thinking about the Henderson deal and the juggling act he was attempting for Miles's science presentation. "I'm working on finding that balance." "For what it's worth," David said, lowering his voice slightly. "I think what you're doing is admirable. It would have been easier to just go back to your life in Chicago, maintain a distance. The fact that you're trying to be present, to really be a father to Miles, it says a lot about your character." The unexpected approval caught Ethan off guard. "Thank you. That means a lot, especially coming from you," David shrugged. "Miles deserves to have his father in his life, and from what I've seen, you're a good man, Ethan. Different from what I expected, based on the stories." "Stories?" Ethan asked, raising an eyebrow. "Small town," David reminded him with a grin. "People talk. Riverdale's former golden boy who left everyone behind to make his fortune. You're practically a local legend." "Not all legends are flattering," Ethan observed. "No," David agreed. "But people can surprise you. I think you're surprising a lot of people right now, including Jasmine." Before Ethan could respond, Miles came running back. "Dad, come meet my friends. They don't believe I really have a millionaire father." Ethan laughed, allowing himself to be pulled away. "A duty calls," he said to David, who waved him off with an understanding smile. The rest of the afternoon passed pleasantly. Ethan met Miles's friends, chatted with neighbors, and even reconnected with a few former classmates. Throughout it all, he watched the easy interactions between Miles, Jasmine, and David, the inside jokes, the casual touches, the seamless co-parenting. They were a family, he realized with a pang. A real, functioning family that had formed and flourished without him. His challenge wasn't just to build a relationship with Miles, but to find a place for himself within this existing family structure, without disrupting what already worked so well. As the party began to wind down and guests started to leave, Miles finally got permission to open Ethan's gift. His eyes widened with excitement as he tore away the wrapping paper. "A robot kit," he exclaimed, "and it's the super advanced one. With programming. I thought we could work on it together," Ethan suggested. Miles launched himself at Ethan for a hug. "This is the best present ever. Can we start tonight, please?" Jasmine shook her head, though she was smiling. "It's a school night, Miles, and we still have guests to say goodbye to." "But Mom, your mother's right," Ethan interjected. "But maybe I could come over tomorrow after school. If that's okay with your mom and David?" Jasmine and David exchanged a look, having one of those silent conversations that only people who know each other well can have. "I suppose that would be all right," Jasmine said finally. "David has a school board meeting tomorrow evening anyway." Miles whooped with joy, clutching the robot kit to his chest. "This is going to be so cool." As the last guests departed and Miles went inside to help David clean up, Jasmine and Ethan found themselves alone on the front porch. "Thank you for today," Ethan said, "for including me." Jasmine nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're Miles's father. If you're going to be part of his life, you should know his friends, his home, the people who care about him. You and David have built something special here," Ethan observed, gesturing to the house behind them. "He's a good man." "Yes, he is," Jasmine agreed. "He's been wonderful for Miles and for me." A brief silence fell between them, filled with the weight of their shared history and the years spent apart. "I never forgot you, you know," Ethan said suddenly, the words escaping before he could stop them. "All these years, even when I was at my busiest, there would be moments when something would remind me of you." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly, then softened. "Ethan, I'm not saying that to complicate things," he added quickly. "I respect your relationship with David. I wanted you to know that you were never just someone I left behind. You were someone I carried with me." Jasmine was quiet for a long moment. "There was a time when those words would have meant everything to me," she said finally. "But that was a long time ago. We're different people now." "I know," Ethan acknowledged. "I'm not trying to turn back the clock. I just wanted to be honest with you." She studied his face, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate that, and I'm glad you're here for Miles now. He needs his father." The door opened behind them and Miles bounded out. "Mom, David wants to know where the extra trash bags are." "Under the sink," she called back. "I'll be right in." Miles nodded, then turned to Ethan. "You're still coming tomorrow, right?" "Dad? For the robot?" "Absolutely," Ethan promised. "Right after school." After Miles went back inside, Ethan said his goodbyes to Jasmine and walked to his rental car. As he drove back to the hotel, his mind was a jumble of emotions. Joy at the growing connection with Miles, gratitude for Jasmine and David's openness to including him in their lives, and an ache of what might have been if he had made different choices all those years ago. His phone rang, the car's Bluetooth system displaying Jessica's name on the dashboard screen. "Mr. Caldwell," she began without preamble, "there's a situation developing with the Henderson deal. The legal team has identified a potential issue with the intellectual property rights transfer." Ethan sighed, the real world intruding once again. "How serious?" "Serious enough that the board is calling an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. They're expecting you to video conference in." "What time?" 9 a.m. Chicago time. 8 your time, Ethan calculated quickly. The meeting would likely run for at least 2 hours, which would cut into his morning conference calls, but still leave the afternoon free for Miles. "I'll be there," he said. "Send me the briefing materials tonight." After hanging up, Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly. He had thought finding a balance between his two worlds would be challenging but manageable. Now he was beginning to wonder if it was possible at all. Monday morning found Ethan in his hotel room, laptop open, dressed in a suit for the video conference with his board of directors. The discussion about the Henderson deal was heated, with various board members arguing for different approaches to the intellectual property concerns. "Gentlemen, ladies," Ethan said, cutting through the debate. "We need a unified strategy before Wednesday's meeting. Victor Henderson isn't going to wait while we argue amongst ourselves." "Then perhaps you should be here in person, leading this discussion," remarked Philip Wainwright, one of the older board members, who had been skeptical of Ethan's extended absence. Instead of hiding away in some small town, Ethan bristled at the implication. "I'm not hiding, Philip. I'm dealing with a personal matter that requires my presence here, and I'll be in Chicago for the Henderson meeting on Wednesday morning." "Just the meeting," Wainwright pressed. "Not the preparation, not the strategy sessions?" "My team is more than capable of preparing the revised documents," Ethan replied, struggling to maintain his professional tone. "And I'm available by phone or video conference at any time." "That's not the same as being here, and you know it," Wainwright countered. "Caldwell Technologies is at a critical juncture. We can't afford to have a part-time CEO." The words hit Ethan, hard because they echoed his own fears. Was he letting down the company he had built from nothing? Were his priorities shifting too dramatically, too quickly? "I understand your concerns," Ethan said carefully, "but I assure you, my commitment to this company hasn't changed. What has changed is that I now have additional responsibilities that I'm learning to balance." "This son you suddenly discovered," Wainwright said, his tone making the air quotes almost audible. "How do you even know he's yours? Have you had a paternity test?" A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs went through the video conference. Several board members shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the personal nature of the question. Ethan's jaw tightened. "My relationship with my son is not up for discussion in this forum, Philip. Let's focus on the Henderson deal." The key meeting continued for another hour, with the tension never fully dissipating. By the time it ended, Ethan was drained and irritated. Wainwright's questions, though inappropriately voiced, had touched on doubts that Ethan himself had carefully avoided examining. A paternity test had never crossed his mind. From the moment he saw Miles, he had known, bone deep, that this was his child. The resemblance was undeniable, and yet would a responsible businessman make such a life-altering decision without verification? He pushed the thought away as he changed out of his suit into casual clothes. Miles was his son. He felt it in his heart, and that was enough. The rest of the morning was consumed by emails and phone calls. At lunchtime, Ethan drove to the real estate office to sign papers for the house on Maple Street. It wasn't his dream home by any means, a modest 4-bedroom colonial that needed updating, but it was in a good neighborhood close to Miles's school, and it had a large backyard, perfect for playing catch. "Congratulations, Mr. Caldwell," the real estate agent said, handing him the keys. The previous owners were thrilled to have such a quick closing. They've already moved to Florida. "When can I move in?" Ethan asked. "Right away. The house is empty and all yours, though you might want to do some painting or renovations before you fully settle in." Ethan nodded, already mentally designing a bedroom for Miles for his overnight visits. "I'll have some furniture delivered this week. For now, I just need a place that's not a hotel room." By 3:30, Ethan was pulling up in front of Jasmine and David's house. Miles was waiting on the front steps, the robot kit open beside. Him instruction manual already in hand. "Dad," he called out, waving enthusiastically, "I've been reading the instructions. This is going to be the coolest robot ever." Ethan felt the weight of the morning's business tensions melt away as he joined his son on the porch. "Let's see what we're working with here." For the next 2 hours, they sat side by side at the kitchen table, sorting through components and following the complex instructions. Miles was a quick learner, absorbing Ethan's explanations about circuitry and programming with eager intelligence. Jasmine moved around them, preparing dinner and occasionally stopping to observe their progress. Ethan was acutely aware of her presence, of the domestic scene they created together, almost like the family they might have been. "You're really good at explaining things," Miles said as they connected the robot's motion sensors. "Way better than my science teacher." "Your dad has always been good at taking complicated ideas and making them simple," Jasmine remarked, surprising Ethan with the compliment. "That's how he helped me pass calculus in high school." Miles looked up, interested. "You helped Mom with math?" "She helped me with English literature in return," Ethan said, smiling at the memory. We were study partners junior and senior year. Before you became boyfriend and girlfriend? Miles asked innocently. Jasmine and Ethan exchanged a quick glance, both clearly wondering how much of their history was appropriate to share. Something like that, Jasmine said vaguely. Miles, why don't you go wash up for dinner? David should be home soon. Once Miles had left the room, Jasmine turned to Ethan. I hope that wasn't uncomfortable for you. Not at all, Ethan assured her. He's curious about our past, that's natural. Yes, but there are parts of our history that are complicated. She hesitated. I've never told him why you left town, or why we broke up. I've always just said we were young and had different paths to follow. That's not untrue, Ethan pointed out. No, but it's not the whole story either. Jasmine sighed, leaning against the counter. He's going to ask more questions as he gets older, about why you weren't in his life until now. And what will you tell him? Ethan asked softly. The truth, she said simply, that I made a choice not to tell you about him because I was hurt and proud, and that you made a choice to be part of his life as soon as you knew about him. Ethan felt a rush of gratitude for her fairness. Thank you for that, for not making Sammy the villain in the story. We were both young, Jasmine said with a sad smile, both stubborn, both made mistakes. Before Ethan could respond, the front door opened and David called out a greeting. The moment of connection between them passed, replaced by the reality of their current situation. Dinner was pleasant, if slightly awkward. David asked about the robot project, and Miles recounted their progress with enthusiasm. Ethan tried to be warm but respectful, conscious of being a guest in another man's home. After dinner, as Ethan prepared to leave, Miles looked disappointed. But we're not finished with the robot yet. We can work on it more tomorrow, Ethan promised. And I have some news for you. What news? Miles asked eagerly. I bought a house today, Ethan said, watching his son's face light up. Right here in Riverdale on Maple Street. For real? Miles exclaimed. You're really staying? I'll still need to travel to Chicago for work sometimes, Ethan cautioned. But yes, I'm really staying. And the house has an extra bedroom that I thought maybe you could help me decorate. For when you come to visit, Miles launched himself at Ethan, hugging him tightly. This is the best news ever. Can I come see it tomorrow? Ethan looked to Jasmine, who nodded her permission. I don't see why not. After homework, of course. As Ethan drove back to the hotel for what would be one of his last nights there, he felt both elated and anxious. He had committed to this new life, bought a house, promised his son he was staying, and yet the demands of his old life remained insistent. His phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. Final contract revisions for Henderson are in your email. Legal needs your feedback by morning. Ethan sighed, knowing he faced another late night of work, but for the first time in his career, the prospect didn't energize him the way it once had. Instead, he found himself wishing he was still at the kitchen table with Miles, building a robot and creating memories that no business deal could ever replace. Tuesday morning brought a flurry of last-minute preparations for Ethan's trip to Chicago. His flight was scheduled for late evening, which would put him in Chicago around midnight. The Henderson meeting was set for 9 a.m. Wednesday, after which he would rush back to the airport for a 1 p.m. flight to Riverdale, hopefully arriving with just enough time to make it to Miles's science presentation at 4. The schedule was tight, leaving no room for delays or complications. Ethan had never cut a business trip so close before, always preferring to build in buffer time for unexpected issues. But Miles's expectant face when he talked about his presentation made the risk worth taking. He spent the morning on more video calls, then the afternoon showing Miles his new house. The boy raced from room to room, already planning where furniture should go and which bedroom would be his. This one, Miles declared, standing in a sunny corner room with a view of the backyard. It has the best view for a telescope. Can I have a telescope, Dad? I don't see why not, Ethan said, making a mental note to research telescopes suitable for 8-year-olds. We could stargaze together. And the backyard is perfect for playing catch, Miles continued, his excitement boundless. And for a dog. Can we get a dog, Dad? Ethan laughed. One step at a time, buddy. Let me get some furniture in here first. They spent an hour measuring rooms and making lists of what Ethan would need to purchase. Miles's enthusiasm was infectious, and Ethan found himself genuinely excited about creating a home here in Riverdale. When it was time to take Miles back to Jasmine's, the boy's mood dampened. "Do you have to go to Chicago tonight? Can't you just do your meeting on the computer like you did yesterday?" Ethan knelt down to Miles's eye level. "I wish I could, buddy. But this is a really important meeting that I have to do in person. It's just for one day, and I'll be back in time for your science presentation tomorrow. Promise?" Miles asked, his eyes serious. "I promise," Ethan said firmly. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away from seeing that volcano in action." Miles nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Mom says promises are really important, that you should never make one you can't keep." "Your mom is absolutely right," Ethan agreed, feeling the weight of responsibility in that small, trusting face. "And I promise you, Miles, I will always do everything in my power to keep my promises to you." After dropping Miles off with a tight hug and another reassurance about tomorrow's presentation, Ethan headed back to the hotel to pack for his overnight trip. Reynolds was waiting in the lobby to drive him to the airport. "Sir, there's something, so you should know," Reynolds said as they pulled away from the hotel. "The weather forecast for Chicago isn't good. There are thunderstorms predicted for tomorrow afternoon." Ethan frowned. "How bad?" "Bad enough that some afternoon flights are already being flagged as potential cancellations. Your 1 p.m. return might be affected." Anxiety tightened in Ethan's chest. "What about earlier flights? Is there anything leaving right after my meeting?" Reynolds shook his head. "The 1 p.m. is the earliest available, and it's already showing a potential delay." Ethan stared out the window, watching the buildings of Riverdale pass by. Missing Miles's presentation was not an option. He had promised to be there, and the trust in his son's eyes when he made that promise was something he couldn't bear to betray. "Change of plans," he said suddenly. "Take me back to the house on Maple Street." "Sir?" Reynolds looked confused. "I need to make a call first," Ethan said, pulling out his phone and dialing Victor Henderson's number. It took some persuading, but Henderson finally agreed to a video conference instead of an in-person meeting. He wasn't happy about it, and Ethan knew he was risking the deal, but the alternative, breaking his promise to Miles, was unthinkable. "Reynolds," Ethan said after ending the call, "I need you to go to Chicago in my place. You'll bring the contracts and a secure video setup. I'll conference in for the meeting, and you'll handle the physical signing on my behalf." "Are you sure about this, sir?" Reynolds asked, clearly concerned. "Mr. Henderson was very specific about wanting to meet with you personally." "I'm sure," Ethan said firmly. "Some things are more important than business deals, even $100 million ones." As they pulled up to the empty house on Maple Street, Ethan felt a strange mixture of anxiety and peace. He was potentially risking the biggest deal of his career, going against the explicit wishes of an important business partner, and disappointing his board of directors. But he was keeping his promise to his son, and somehow that felt more important than all the rest combined. "I'll need you to have the tech team set up a secure video link here by tomorrow morning," Ethan instructed Reynolds, "and have someone deliver a desk, chair, and whatever else I need for a temporary office setup." "Yes, sir," Reynolds said, still looking bewildered by this uncharacteristic behavior from his normally business-focused boss. As Reynolds drove away, heading to the airport alone, Ethan stood in the empty house that would be his new home. The bare rooms echoed with his footsteps as he walked through, imagining how it would look filled with furniture, with Miles's laughter, with life. His phone rang, Jessica calling from Chicago. "Mr. Caldwell," she began, her voice tight with concern. "I've just heard from Reynolds. Is it true you're not coming to Chicago? The board is going to have a fit." "The board works for me, Jessica, not the other way around," Ethan reminded her, his voice firm. "I'll handle the Henderson meeting via video conference. But, sir, your reputation for personal involvement in major deals is important," Ethan acknowledged, "but not as important as my reputation with my son for keeping my promises." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "This is about your son's school thing. The presentation?" "Yes," Ethan said simply. "I promised him I'd be there, and I'm not going to break that promise. Not for Henderson, not for the board, not for anyone." Another pause, then Jessica's voice softened slightly. I've never known you to put anything above business before. Things change, Ethan said. People change. When you have a child, your priorities change. I'll do what I can to smooth things over with the board, Jessica offered. Reynolds and I will make sure everything is prepared for the video conference. Thank you, Jessica, Ethan said, genuinely grateful. I appreciate your support. After ending the call, Ethan stood in what would be the living room, looking out at the darkening sky. He had just made perhaps the most significant business gamble of his career, risking a major deal and potentially undermining his authority with his board, all for the sake of a child's science presentation. And yet, he felt more certain of this decision than of any business choice he had ever made. Because when Miles looked at him with trusting eyes and asked, "Promise?" the answer couldn't be anything but absolute. His phone buzzed with a text from Jasmine. "Miles wants to say goodnight before bed. Can he call you?" Ethan smiled, typing back, "Absolutely." When the phone rang moments later, Miles's excited voice came through. "Dad, I practiced my presentation 5 times tonight. Mom and David said it's perfect." "I can't wait to see it," Ethan said. "I'm sure you're going to do great." "Are you in Chicago yet?" Miles asked. "Actually, no," Ethan replied, deciding honesty was the best approach. "There's a big storm coming, and I was worried about flights being cancelled tomorrow. So I'm staying in Riverdale and doing my meeting by video instead." "Really?" Miles sounded surprised. "But Mom said it was a super important meeting." "It is," Ethan confirmed. "But being at your presentation is important too, and I made you a promise." "Oh," Miles said, his voice small with wonder. "Nobody's ever changed their work plans for me before." The simple statement nearly broke Ethan's heart. "Well, get used to it, buddy, because from now on, you come first. Always." There was a brief silence, then Miles asked, "Dad, I'm really glad." "You're my father." "Me too, Miles," Ethan replied, his throat tight with emotion. "Being your dad is the best thing that's ever happened to me." After they said goodnight, Ethan sat on the floor of his empty house, leaning back against the wall. In the silence, he thought about the path that had led him here, the driven young man who had left Riverdale with dreams of success, the ruthless businessman he had become, and now, the father he was learning to be. The house was empty, echoing, devoid of furniture or warmth, but as Ethan sat there, he could already hear the ghost of future laughter, see the shadow of the home it would become. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time ever, he felt he was exactly where he was meant to be. The son he never knew. Part 4. The morning of Miles's science presentation dawned clear and bright in Riverdale, but in Chicago, dark storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Ethan sat at the hastily assembled desk in his new house, reviewing the Henderson contract one last time before the video conference. Reynolds had arranged for overnight delivery of the essential office equipment: a desk, chair, computer monitors, and the secure video link needed for the meeting. The single room furnished amid the empty house created a strange contrast that somehow felt symbolic of Ethan's life at the moment. 1 foot in his corporate world, 1 foot in his new role as a father. At precisely 9 a.m., the video conference began. Victor Henderson's face appeared on the screen, his expression making it clear he was not pleased with the change in plans. "Ethan," he said curtly, "I'd say it's good to see you, but I was expecting to see you in person. I appreciate your flexibility." "Victor," Ethan replied, keeping his tone professional despite the tension. "Some unavoidable personal matters required me to remain in Riverdale." "Personal matters," Henderson repeated, his skepticism evident. "I've known you for 6 years, Ethan. I've never known anything personal to interfere with your business before." "Things change," Ethan said simply. "Now, shall we review the revised intellectual property terms?" The meeting proceeded, with Reynolds in Chicago handling the physical documents, while Ethan directed the negotiations from Riverdale. Despite the awkward setup, Ethan was in top form, addressing Henderson's concerns with the confidence and strategic insight that had built his reputation. "One final point," Henderson said as they neared the conclusion. "The overseas distribution rights. Your legal team has proposed a 3-year exclusive period, but I'm pushing for 5. Ethan knew this was a critical negotiating point. The difference between 3 and 5 years of exclusivity could mean millions in potential revenue for Caldwell Technologies. Under normal circumstances, he would hold firm at 3 years, possibly compromising at 4 if absolutely necessary. But the clock on his wall showed 11:30 a.m., and Miles's presentation was at 4. He needed this meeting wrapped up with enough time to prepare. 4 years, Ethan offered, cutting through what could have been hours. More negotiation. With an option to extend for a 5th year if certain performance metrics are met. Henderson looked surprised by the quick concession, but pleased. Agreed. Have your team draft that language and we'll move forward. The meeting concluded successfully, with Henderson signing the preliminary agreement. As the video call ended, Jessica's face appeared in a separate window. "Sir, the board is requesting an immediate update. Should I connect them now?" Ethan checked. The time again. "Make it quick. I have a prior commitment at 4. The board meeting was less pleasant. Philip Wainwright was particularly vocal about his disapproval of Ethan's handling of the Henderson deal. "A 4-year exclusivity period?" Wainwright said, his voice sharp with criticism. "We had agreed on 3. That's an unnecessary concession that will cost us millions." "It got the deal done," Ethan replied firmly, "and the performance metrics will protect our interests. Sometimes compromise is necessary to move forward." "Is that what you're doing in your personal life as well?" Wainwright asked pointedly. "Compromising the company's interests for this family situation you've suddenly discovered?" Several other board members shifted uncomfortably at the personal attack, but Ethan remained calm. "My personal life is not up for discussion in this forum," he said coolly. "But let me be clear about something. I built this company from nothing. I've sacrificed evenings, weekends, holidays, years of my life to make Caldwell Technologies what it is today. I've earned the right to balance my professional responsibilities with my personal ones." "The company needs a full-time CEO," Wainwright insisted, "not someone with divided loyalties." "My loyalty to this company isn't in question," Ethan countered. "But from now on, I also have loyalty to my son. I've made arrangements to ensure both responsibilities are met, including a satellite office here in Riverdale and an expanded role for the executive team in day-to-day operations." Before Wainwright could respond, another board member, Diane Chen, spoke up. "I think what Ethan is proposing makes sense. Many CEOs operate remotely part of the time these days. As long as the company continues to perform, I don't see an issue." "Thank you." "Hugh, Diane," Ethan said. "Now if there's nothing else, I have another commitment this afternoon." "This discussion isn't over," Wainwright warned as the meeting ended. Ethan sighed as he closed his laptop. Wainwright had been a thorn in his side since joining the board 3 years ago, but this was the first time the man had directly challenged his leadership. It was a situation he would need to address eventually, but not today. Today was about Miles. His phone rang. It was Jasmine. "Ethan, how did your meeting go?" she asked. "Better than expected," he replied. "The deal is moving forward. How's Miles?" "Nervous about his presentation." "A little," Jasmine admitted. "He keeps asking if you're really going to be there." "I'll be there," Ethan assured her. "Front row just like I promised." "Good," Jasmine said, a note of approval in her voice. "David and I will save you a seat. The presentation starts at 4, but I'd suggest getting there by 3:30 to find parking. The school lot fills up quickly on event days." After they hung up, Ethan took a moment to look around the empty house. Soon it would be filled with furniture, with life, with a sense of home. He had already arranged for deliveries to begin the following day, with Miles's bedroom furniture being the first priority. With a few hours to spare before the presentation, Ethan decided to visit the one place in Riverdale he had been avoiding since his return, the cemetery where his father was buried. The Riverdale cemetery was quiet on the Wednesday afternoon, with only a groundskeeper visible in the distance. Ethan walked the familiar path to the section where the Caldwell family plot was located. His father's grave was marked with a simple headstone. Robert Caldwell, 1945-2018. Ethan stood before it, hands in his pockets, unsure why he had come, or what he expected to feel. His relationship with his father had been strained at best, openly hostile at worst. Robert Caldwell had been a bitter man, resentful of his son's ambitions and success, unable to move past his Own failures. Well, Dad, Ethan said quietly to the stone, I have a son now, a boy you never knew existed. He's everything I wasn't as a kid, open, trusting, full of joy. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. His father had never supported his dreams, had actively tried to hold him back, insisting that Caldwell's weren't meant for success. That resentment had fueled Ethan's drive to prove him wrong, to become successful at any cost. And now, here he was, a father himself, realizing that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. I'm not going to be the kind of father you were, Ethan continued, his voice firm despite the empty cemetery. I'm going to support Miles, believe in him, be there for him. I'm going to break the cycle. As he turned to leave, he noticed an elderly woman placing flowers on a nearby grave. It took him a moment to recognize her, Mrs. Cooper, Frank's widow. Mrs. Cooper, he called softly, walking toward her. She looked up, surprise and then recognition crossing her face. Ethan Caldwell, I heard you were back in town. Her eyes drifted to the gravestone he had been standing at. Paying your respects? Something like that, Ethan said, not wanting to explain his complicated feelings about his father. I wanted to tell you again how sorry I am about Frank. He was a good man. Mrs. Cooper nodded, her eyes soft with grief but also warm with memories. The best I ever knew. He was so proud of you, you know. Always kept articles about your company, showed them to anyone who would listen. That's the boy I gave his first job, he'd say. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. Frank Cooper had been more of a father figure to him than his own dad ever was. I wish I had stayed in touch better, visited more. We all have regrets, Ethan, Mrs. Cooper said gently, but Frank understood. He knew you had to forge your own path. She paused, then added, I hear you have a son now. That must have been quite a surprise. News really did travel fast in Riverdale. Yes, Ethan confirmed. Miles, he's 8 years old and he's amazing, Mrs. Cooper. I wish Frank could have met him. He would have loved that, she agreed. Frank always said you'd make a wonderful father someday, if you ever slowed down enough to have a family. The simple statement hit Ethan hard. Frank had seen something in him that he hadn't seen in himself, the potential to be not just a successful businessman, but a good father. It was a vote of confidence from beyond the grave that meant more than any board approval ever could. I'm trying, Ethan said honestly. I'm learning as I go. Mrs. Cooper patted his arm. That's all any parent can do, dear. Now don't let me keep you. I'm sure you have places to be. Ethan checked his watch, 2:45 p.m. Actually, I do. Miles has a science presentation at school this afternoon. Then you'd better not be late, Mrs. Cooper said with a knowing smile. Nothing matters more to a child than seeing their parent in the audience, watching them shine. With a final goodbye to Mrs. Cooper, Ethan headed to his car. The visit to the cemetery had been unexpectedly meaningful, giving him both closure with his past and clarity about his future. He would not repeat his father's mistakes. He would be present, supportive, loving, everything Robert Caldwell had failed to be. Riverdale Elementary School was buzzing with activity when Ethan arrived. Parents streamed into the building, many carrying cameras and flowers for their children. Ethan felt a pang of regret that he hadn't thought to bring anything for Miles, then spotted a small gift shop set up in the lobby, selling flowers and small stuffed animals. He purchased a small stuffed volcano with googly eyes that seemed amusingly appropriate for the occasion, then made his way to the auditorium. Jasmine had been right about the parking. He'd had to park 2 blocks away and jog to make it by 3:30. Inside, the auditorium was filling quickly with parents and siblings. The stage was set up with small tables, each featuring a different science project. Ethan scanned the crowd, finally spotting Jasmine waving to him from the front row. You made it, she said, as he slid into the seat she had saved next to her. David sat on her other side, nodding a greeting to Ethan. Wouldn't miss it, Ethan replied. How's Miles, nervous? Excited more. Than nervous, Jasmine said. He's been practicing his presentation all day. He's at station number 5 over there. She pointed to a table where their volcano model stood proudly, painted in realistic shades of brown and red. Did your meeting go well? David asked politely. Yes, better than expected, Ethan said. We closed the deal. That's good, David nodded. Miles was worried your work might keep you away. Nothing could have kept me away, Ethan said firmly. This is too important. The principal approached the microphone and welcomed everyone to the fourth grade science showcase. The children filed onto the stage from behind the curtain, each taking their place at their project table. Miles scanned the audience anxiously until he spotted Ethan. His face broke into a wide, relieved smile, and he waved excitedly. Ethan waved back, holding up the stuffed volcano so Miles could see it. The boy's grin widened even further. The presentations began with each child given 3 minutes to explain their project. Miles was the fifth presenter, and when his turn came, he stood tall and spoke with confidence that made Ethan's chest swell with pride. My volcano demonstrates the scientific principle of chemical reactions, Miles began, his voice clear and strong. When you combine baking soda, which is a base, with vinegar, which is an acid, they create a chemical reaction that produces carbon dioxide gas. The gas creates pressure inside the volcano, forcing the liquid up and out in a simulation of an eruption. He proceeded to demonstrate, carefully pouring the vinegar into the baking soda-filled chamber of the volcano. The mixture bubbled and foamed, creating a satisfyingly dramatic eruption that flowed down the sides of the model. The audience applauded appreciatively. My dad helped me build this volcano, Miles added, looking directly at Ethan with pride. He taught me all about how real volcanoes work and how the pressure builds up underneath until it has to find a way out. Just like in our model. The simple acknowledgement meant more to Ethan than any business award he had ever received. He nodded, encouragingly at Miles, who finished his presentation with a confident bow. After all the children had presented, the principal invited the audience to come up on stage to view the projects up close and talk with the young scientists. Ethan, Jasmine, and David made their way to Miles's table. You were amazing, Ethan said, handing Miles the stuffed volcano. Your explanation was clear, scientific, and you spoke like a true expert. Really? Miles beamed. I was nervous, but then I saw you in the audience, and I remembered everything you taught me about volcanoes. We're very proud of you, Jasmine said, giving her son a hug. You worked so hard on this project. Dad did a lot too, Miles said, generously. He helped me with the design and the painting. It was all your idea, though, Ethan reminded him. I just helped with the execution. As other parents and children stopped by to admire the volcano, Ethan stepped back slightly, watching the easy interaction between Miles, Jasmine, and David. They functioned seamlessly as a family unit, with inside jokes and familiar routines. For a moment he felt like an outsider again, watching a life he wasn't truly part of. Then Miles looked up, searching for him in the crowd, and broke into a smile when their eyes met. Dad, come show Mrs. Johnson how we made the lava look so real. And just like that, Ethan was included, pulled back into the circle of family by his son's simple desire to have him there. After the presentations ended and the children had cleaned up their stations, families began to file out of the auditorium. Miles bounced between Ethan and Jasmine, clutching his stuffed volcano and beaming with post-presentation excitement. Can we go for ice cream to celebrate? He asked hopefully. Dad too? Jasmine exchanged a glance with David, who nodded with an easy smile. I think that's a great idea, she agreed. Ethan, would you like to join us? I'd love to, Ethan said, grateful for the invitation. They walked together to the local ice cream parlor, with Miles skipping ahead, occasionally turning to make sure they were all following. Inside, they found a booth near the window, with Miles insisting on sitting next to Ethan. So, David said as they waited for their ice cream, I hear you bought the house on Maple Street. That's right, Ethan confirmed. It needs some updating, but it's in a great location. Mrs. Wilson lives across the street, Miles informed him. She's my English teacher, and she makes the best chocolate chip cookies ever. I'll have to introduce myself, Ethan said. Make a good impression on the neighbors. When are you moving in? Jasmine asked. The furniture starts arriving. Tomorrow, Ethan replied. I'm hoping to be fully moved in by the weekend. Can I help? Miles asked eagerly. Please, I want to see my room. Sure, Ethan said, unable to resist his son's enthusiasm. If it's okay with your mom, Maybe you could come over on Saturday to help me unpack and set things up." Jasmine nodded, her agreement. "That sounds fine. David and I have some wedding planning to do on Saturday anyway." The mention of the wedding created a brief awkward silence. It was the first time Jasmine had directly referenced her upcoming marriage to David in Ethan's presence. "When's the big day?" Ethan asked, deciding it was better to acknowledge it directly than pretend it wasn't happening. "August 15th, David answered. "Just a small ceremony at the community church, followed by a reception at my sister's farm outside town." "Miles is going to be the ring bearer," Jasmine added, smiling at her son. "And I get to wear a tuxedo," Miles said excitedly. "With a bow tie and everything. You'll look very handsome," Ethan said, forcing a smile despite the unexpected pang. He felt at the image of Miles participating in Jasmine's wedding to another man. It was irrational, he knew. He had no claim on Jasmine after all these years. She deserved happiness, and David seemed like a genuinely good man. Still, some small part of him couldn't help wondering what might have been if he had made different choices years ago. If he had known about Miles from the beginning, would they be a family now? Ethan, Jasmine, and their son. Their ice cream arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Miles dug into his chocolate sundae with gusto, getting a dab of whipped cream on his nose that made them all laugh. As the afternoon faded into evening and they prepared to part ways in the parking lot, Miles hugged Ethan tightly. "Thank you for coming to my presentation, Dad. It meant a lot to me. I wouldn't have missed it for anything," Ethan said sincerely, hugging his son back. "I'm so proud of you, Miles." "Will I see you tomorrow?" Miles asked. "I have to oversee the furniture delivery," Ethan explained. "But maybe you could come by after school on Friday. I should have your room set up by then." "Can I, Mom?" Miles turned to Jasmine hopefully. "We'll see," she said, not committing fully. "It depends on how your homework situation looks." After Miles and David had climbed into the car, Jasmine lingered a moment longer with Ethan. "Thank you for being there today," she said quietly. "It meant the world to him." "It meant the world to me too," Ethan replied. Watching him up there, seeing how smart and confident he is, it was amazing. "You've done such a wonderful job raising him, Jasmine." She smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "He's a special kid. He makes it easy to be a good parent." There was a moment of silence between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts and what-ifs. "Jasmine," Ethan began hesitantly, "I know this isn't my place to ask, but are you happy? With David, I mean." She looked surprised by the question, then thoughtful. "Yes," she said finally. "He's a good man, kind, stable, devoted to Miles. He makes us feel safe." Ethan nodded, noting what she hadn't said. Safe was not the same as passionate or exciting or deeply in love, but perhaps after the turbulence of their young relationship and the challenges of raising Miles alone, safe was exactly what Jasmine needed and wanted. "I'm glad," he said sincerely. "You deserve to be happy." "So do you, Ethan," she replied, softly. "And I think Miles is bringing you happiness I never saw in you before. Even when we were together, there was always a restlessness in you, a hunger for something more. But when you're with him, you seem content." Her insight struck him deeply because she was right. Success, wealth, power, he had achieved them all, yet none had brought him the simple joy he felt watching his son explain a volcano model or building a robot together at the kitchen table. "He's changed everything," Ethan admitted. "I never knew I could love someone this much, this quickly." Jasmine smiled. "That's parenthood for you. It rewrites your heart overnight." She glanced toward the car where Miles and David were waiting. "I should go. Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Jasmine," he replied, watching as she walked away, just as he had so many years ago. Only this time there was no bitterness or regret, just a gentle acknowledgement that their paths, though separate, would always be connected through the wonderful boy they had created together. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Ethan's new house slowly transformed from an empty shell into a home. Furniture was delivered, rooms were painted, appliances were installed. Ethan threw himself into the process with the same focus and attention to detail he usually reserved for business deals. Miles's room received special attention. Ethan had consulted with his son on every detail, from the space-themed bedspread to the desk designed for homework and robot building projects. A telescope stood by the window, ready for their promised stargazing sessions. By Friday afternoon, when Miles came to visit, the transformation was nearly complete. The boy raced from room to room, exclaiming over each new discovery and addition. "This is the coolest house ever," Miles declared, flopping onto his new bed. "And my room is perfect. Can I sleep over tonight, please, Dad?" Ethan looked to Jasmine, who had accompanied Miles for guidance. They hadn't discussed overnight visits yet, and he wasn't sure what the protocol was. "Not tonight," Jasmine said gently. "Dad just moved in, and he probably doesn't have all the things you need for an overnight stay yet." "Like what?" Miles asked, disappointed. "Well, for one thing, food," Jasmine pointed out with a smile. "Is there anything in your refrigerator?" "Ethan? Not much," he admitted. "I was planning to go grocery shopping tomorrow." "See?" Jasmine said to Miles. "Let's give Dad a chance to get settled in, and then we can talk about sleepovers. Maybe next weekend?" Miles brightened at this compromise. "Promise, Mom?" "If your dad is ready by then, yes," Jasmine agreed. "I'll be ready," Ethan assured them both. "In fact, why don't we plan a proper housewarming for next Saturday? Miles can help me host, and then have his first sleepover here. Can we invite?" "Mom and David too?" Miles asked innocently. "And my friends from baseball and Mrs. Wilson from across the street?" Ethan smiled at his son's enthusiasm. "Let's not get carried away, buddy. We'll start small. Maybe just your mom and David and one or two of your closest friends." As they continued the tour of the house, Ethan's phone rang. He checked the screen and saw it was Jessica. "Excuse me, I need to take this," he said, stepping into his office and closing the door. "Jessica, what's up?" he asked. "Sir, there's been a development with Wainwright," she said, her voice tense. "He's called for a special board meeting to discuss your leadership." Ethan's stomach tightened. "On what grounds?" "He's citing concerns about your commitment to the company given your new personal situation. He's suggesting a leave of absence might be appropriate while you sort out your—" his words, not mine. "Family drama." Anger flared in Ethan. "He's trying to push me out." "It looks that way," Jessica agreed. "The meeting is scheduled for Monday morning. He's expected to make a formal motion." "Who's supporting him?" Ethan asked, already mentally counting votes. "It's hard to say for sure. Chen is definitely in your corner. Martin and Takahashi are probably with you too. But Rodriguez and Thompson seemed swayed by Wainwright's arguments, and the others are keeping quiet." Ethan considered his options. He could fly to Chicago for the meeting, confront Wainwright directly and reassert his authority, or he could handle it remotely, which might play into Wainwright's narrative about his divided focus. "Book me on a flight to Chicago for Sunday afternoon," he decided. "I need to be there in person for this." "Yes, sir," Jessica said, relief evident in her voice. "What about your return? Should I leave it open-ended?" Ethan thought of Miles, of his promise to host a housewarming the following Saturday, of the possibility of his son's first overnight stay. "No. Book me back for Tuesday evening. I'll only need 2 days to handle this." After ending the call, Ethan took a moment to compose himself before rejoining Jasmine and Miles. The last thing he wanted was to worry them with his business problems. But when he opened the door, he found Jasmine, standing there, concern etched on her face. From her expression, it was clear she had overheard at least part of the conversation. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "Just some politics at the company," Ethan said, trying to downplay the situation. "Nothing I can't handle." Jasmine studied his face. "You have to go back to Chicago." "Just for a couple of days," he assured her. "Sunday to Tuesday. I'll be back in plenty of time for the housewarming next weekend." She nodded, though her expression remained concerned. Before she could say more, Miles called from downstairs. "Mom, Dad, come see the backyard. There's a perfect spot for a treehouse." "Coming," Jasmine called back, then turned to Ethan. "We can talk about this later if you need to." Her offer of support touched him. "Thanks, but it's really just routine business drama. Nothing for you to worry about." As they headed downstairs to join Miles, Ethan tried to convince himself that was true. Wainwright was making a play for power, but it was doomed to fail. The board knew what Ethan had built. what he continued to contribute. A few days in Chicago, some reassurances about his commitment, and the problem would be resolved. Yet as he watched Miles excitedly point out the perfect tree for a future tree house, doubt crept in. What if Wainwright succeeded? What if the board decided Ethan's new family commitments made him less valuable as a CEO? What would that mean for his life in Chicago, for the company he had built from nothing, for his identity as a successful businessman? And more importantly, what would it mean for his ability to provide for Miles, to give his son the life he deserved? The questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside for now. This evening was about Miles, about their growing bond, about the home they would share at least part of the time. Business concerns could wait until Sunday. "You're right, buddy," he said, examining the sturdy oak tree Miles had identified. "That would make a perfect treehouse. Maybe we can start designing one this summer." Miles's face lit up with excitement. "Really? You mean it?" "I mean it," Ethan confirmed, ruffling his son's hair. "Every boy needs a treehouse, and every father needs a project to build with his son." As Miles launched into elaborate plans for what the treehouse should include, Ethan caught Jasmine watching them with a soft, thoughtful expression. When their eyes met, she gave him a small smile, one that seemed to contain understanding, encouragement, and perhaps a touch of something more. In that moment, Ethan made a silent promise to himself and to Miles. No matter what happened in Chicago, no matter what Wainwright or the board decided, he would not let anything threaten this new life he was building. He had left Riverdale once before, walking away from love and unknowingly from fatherhood. He would not make that mistake again. Some things were worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, and the joy on his son's face as they planned their future together was definitely one of them.